I'm Carol Pineau, and I am with GeoPoll. We are a mobile polling company that gathers data from community-based data from throughout Africa, throughout the world, but particularly in Africa, and have been doing a lot of polling on food security issues, agriculture, predictions, things like that. But with me today, we have a fantastic panel that really brings together all the different sides of agriculture and the whole issue from financing to governance. I don't think we have any real farmers, but other than that, I think we have everybody in there. So we have, do you farm at all?
Yeah.
All right, well, see, we do have all of it. All right. So we have Anwesiu Tadesse, who is the CEO of PTA Bank, a trade and development bank of Eastern and Southern Africa. And we have Bruno Wynn, who is the CEO of DEG, the German, one of the largest European development financing institutions. And we have His Excellency Akinwumi Adesina, Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development in Nigeria. And as he said, that sort of is self-explanatory. We all know what the Ministry of Agriculture does. And I can't see around here. Okay. Patrick Dlamini, CEO of DBSA South Africa, which is the Development Bank of South Africa, owned by the South African government, but has a continent-wide focus. And Lutaf Kassam, who is the Group Managing Director of IPS. We're going to take questions from the audience in just a minute, but before we do, I'd like just to, you brought up the things that the World Bank could do, and I'd like to actually just go down with everyone talking about this just very briefly. Everyone talks about how agriculture is so important, but, the question is not just, we now know that people are listening to this, but what concretely needs to be done? So what could the World Bank do to help build bankable agribusiness projects, and how can they help to scale up the pipeline of bankable projects? And I'd just like if we just went down and everyone just talks very briefly of ideas of, concretely, what really could be done. And for you in the audience, please think of your questions because you're coming next.
Okay, well, maybe being very specific. There's two things I think that the World Bank can do. I think one is on the general side of things. Agribusiness is like any business. So there are certain things that affect all businesses. And so, for instance, the whole question of the investment climate, environment of doing business, that, of course, is a rising tide that lifts all boats. In fact, the one thing that's happened in Africa has been a general improvement in the business environment, which has made agriculture also now much more relevant compared to all other business areas, whether it's retail, construction, banking. There's been a huge turnaround in the attractiveness of Africa, and agriculture is a part of it. And I think clearly the investment climate aspect, which of course the World Bank is quite specialized in, together with one or two other institutions, that's helped a great deal. I think we need to keep that in mind. Of course, finance is the lifeblood of any business. Access to finance in Africa across all business segments is a huge issue today. It's always in the top 3 constraints listed by any private firm or even state-owned enterprise in order to grow what they're doing. So the question is, how can we continue to deal with that aspect of things? We've spoken a lot about infrastructure. I think the World Bank is doing quite a bit there together with the other DFIs, and indeed governments themselves are putting in record levels of financing into infrastructure. So that's one part of the picture, but it's not the only part. Any business will tell you today that getting access to working capital, getting access to trade finance, getting access to long-term finance, these are serious constraints. That's a general business environment issue that still needs to be addressed, and I think the World Bank has a role to play, both on the policy side, but also on the input side. On the input side, that's the role of the IFC to provide or to facilitate access to credit in the environments where credit is still a constraint. Of course, the good news is Africa has also dramatically improved its financial sector. I think the good news is the banking sector is so much more advanced today than it was 10 years ago. There are so many more banks. You just look at any ratio on access to credit, it's improved. So I think strengthening banks in Africa also is part of the solution, so that the ordinary borrowers who are too small to access big DFIs, whether it's the IFC, DEG, or even PTA Bank, would have access to normal commercial banks so that they can get certain things done. I think of course there is a strategic issue. Maybe the World Bank can handle it, but there's always been a structural problem in the past that's worked against agriculture in Africa, and that's the terms of trade, the relative pricing of food versus other products. And the one big shift that occurred about 7 or so years ago is the price of food, the real prices of food went up in a big way. We all knew what happened to commodities. Oil and metals went up in a huge way in 2003. It took 4 years for food to respond. Food really peaked in 2007. It came down again, but all indications are that food prices will continue to grow going into the future. That's actually a good thing, because that stimulates the supply side of the solution, and we see what's happening on the demand side. Incomes are rising, not just in Africa, but also in Asia. Asia is actually a very interesting part of the African ag story, because Asia can be an important source of demand. And I think then the question is trade policy. Can the World Bank help to strengthen trade policy, trade within Africa? And of course, there's other African institutions who will do this, but also trade internationally, so that African producers or investors, global investors in African agriculture, can readily export to the rest of the world and take advantage of the comparative advantages that the minister spoke about as being very key for Africa to leverage itself in this space. So just to summarize, I would say finance, strengthening access to finance, dealing with trade policies, and of course continuing to build infrastructure, not just large-scale infrastructure, but addressing smaller-scale infrastructure such as storage facilities and feeder roads that actually make a difference to the producers in the rural areas.
Thank you so much. I think you've given us quite a comprehensive list. I think we'll just add on as we go down.
Yeah,
Bruno.
has already touched on a lot of issues, and I fully subscribe to this. So let me add only two things. I do not believe that the World Bank should try to make projects bankable. This should be left to the private sector. But what the World Bank can do is simply to reduce the risk of private investors, including small farmers. And I like very much what the ministers said. Accept that agriculture is a business. And by doing that, also accept that small farmers are entrepreneurs. So creating the right incentive system for them. So in many African countries, the farmers are still confronted with extremely low prices for their products. So if this is the case, how you can expect that small farmers are ready to invest, even if they have access to finance? It will not be feasible. So getting things right, I think, is a substantial issue. The agriculture finance is a real big issue, because I fully agree to what the minister has said, that agriculture finance is still perceived as an extremely risky business. And to some extent, it is risky, also in view of climate change. So we have to accept that. But then the question is how we can we introduce, also with the help of governments, innovative schemes. For example, guarantee schemes could extremely helpful to make banks more willing to provide access to agricultural finance. And in doing that, once again, I strongly believe that the World Bank has two major tasks. One is to provide policy advice to governments, which includes also provide access to governments to best practice in other African countries. So simply replicating best practice instead of trying the most expensive way to invent the wheel again and again. And secondly is also to help governments to do it by simply providing the necessary inputs. And I think if doing that, and summarizing, it would create much better opportunities for private investors. in dealing with agriculture development in Africa.
Much, Bruno. Minister Adesina, if you could talk about from the government side what you feel that where the World Bank could really add and help you in promoting agriculture.
I think that the mission of the World Bank is to end poverty in the world. And so the World Bank cannot really succeed in that unless it gets agriculture right, because that is really where majority of the people in the world, the poor people, depend on for livelihoods. So as I said earlier, it means a total paradigm shift itself that, in the way the World Bank, Africa Development Bank, the other DFIs, IFAD, and everybody else deals with agriculture, begin to treat agriculture as a business. It's a wealth-creating sector. We've got to do that. I think it's fundamental that that needs to be mainstream into the world of the World Bank and also the work of the IFC. It's not just about, but look, you cannot redistribute poverty anyway. You've got to create wealth. And so the way to create wealth is to let the private sector engine drive this particular sector. So I think this is fundamental for me that needs to be mainstream. The second one is a point that Bruno raised, which is within the context of climate change. Now, there's going to be quite a lot of vulnerabilities for most of the farmers in the world, in Africa, because we are not using that much of irrigation anyway. So coming up with really good instruments, instruments like insurance, weather index insurance, for example, we know it works in India, but the question really is how do you scale it up to reach millions of farmers? And I really believe that in the earlier phase of scaling up such risk transfer mechanisms, it's important for the bank, the countries, to really subsidize or support smallholder farmers to be able to afford and have access to these weather index insurance products. Otherwise, it can't really go to scale. But if you actually support it in the early phase of it, it means you can crowd in a lot of insurance companies into it. They will innovate. They will develop new products. The premiums will go down, and then it becomes more affordable to farmers. So I think it's something that the World Bank needs to push. One can't talk too much about infrastructure. I think infrastructure is big. Energy deficit in Africa needs to be addressed. We need to actually invest heavily in the issue of rural roads, very important. In fact, if you go around, if you put a rural road somewhere, you're most likely to see a lot of SMEs actually aggregate around those areas. So there's no fastest way to reducing poverty than actually working on infrastructure to connect people and to move goods and services, not only within countries, but also across countries. And finally, I think the reforms that the World Bank, or the organizational changes that the World Bank has done, where you now have the World Bank and you have MEGA, you have IFC working as one to deliver, is so crucial. Because for agriculture, you need infrastructure. You need to have finance, commercial finance. You need IDA financing. So it's really deploying a mix, the right mix of instruments across the whole organization that I think can really help. And of course, in everything, I still believe that at the end of the day, countries are the ones that should put their money down into things. So the World Bank should leverage countries and private sector resources, not try to displace them. Thank you.
Thank you. And Patrick and Luta, we're just going to very briefly have you talk about, if you can address specifically how the World Bank can, in partnership with the private sector, further develop an investable pipeline of agribusiness transactions.
Thank you, Carol. I think it's quite important, given the power that the World Bank has at its disposal and the convening power that actually it also has, that actually we can begin to look at the feasibility study funding as well as a project prep funding actually for agricultural projects, because that's where the biggest problem lies. And that's where actually once you have been able actually to put down that investment, that you can then begin to crystallize the economic dynamics of the agricultural projects, which makes it easier for the private sector and the commercial banks to then be able actually to be crowded into those projects and for those projects to become bankable. But I think the other advantage that the World Bank has is the global benchmarks and the global lessons that it has within its personal across the globe that actually can be able to share with the African governments and the African DFIs and private sector on how actually to best fund and make agricultural projects successful. I think the other thing that is quite important is for the World Bank to work with the African governments and the African DFIs to drive investment in this sector, especially around setting up enabling regulatory environments and skills development in this sector, because that is very, very, very important. And also the funding models, actually agricultural projects and appraisal models actually are required, because once you have the right skill set to appraise these projects, you then can be able also to look at how you can de-risk the agricultural products. Lastly, it's the issue of technological advancements that could also be brought to bear within the agricultural sector. Here I'm talking about the aeroponic farming, which actually then takes away the issue of seasons. It then makes farming a 65 days a year. It also looks at actually how you can best conserve water, which actually is such a critical, scarce resource for so many parts actually in the emerging markets. Here we're also looking at rain radars as well. Rain radars actually that begin to look at weather patterns predictions, and when is the rainfall going to come and how much rain can you anticipate, and then how can the insurance as well as the farmers begin to plan their agricultural outputs and products accordingly. I think the irrigational technologies are also things that we can also bring to bear within this sector. There is a huge room that the World Bank actually can play in making agriculture a thriving sector within the continent. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Luta?
Carol, I think a lot of people have very eloquently said what the World Bank can do, so I don't want to go into all of that. I just have two things that I'd say. One is, I'm even impressed listening to the minister, what Nigeria is trying to do, etc. So, and I ask myself, why isn't this information getting through to all the governments in Africa? I'm saying other models that have worked in Asia, but it's not just the government, even the private sector. I know we always assume that the private sector is smart enough to know what's going on around the world, and they'll find it's not true. Sometimes we need a jog as well as to what are the best practices, what are the stuff that comes out. So to me, I see a lot of strength in the World Bank being able to share things that have worked. It doesn't mean that it'll work in our countries, but it starts off the thought process where people can work. And the one other area which was just talked by Patrick just now, you see the World Bank fund so many 1,000 kilometers of roads. That's infrastructure. Where we don't see the World Bank very strong is irrigation. I am a Kenyan, I come from Kenya, etc. And there we only keep on praying, everyday prayers that the rains will come on time. So you can have large schemes, but even at the community level you can have schemes. There are small water pans that we do. The water pan costs $100, improves the productivity of the farmer by 60%. Now, I know these numbers will be very small for the World Bank, and they'll say this is not exciting. They might not even be exciting for Brooklyn if I start aggregating this. But somewhere we need to find the mechanism how this happens. So I'm saying what needs to be done. I'm not saying the World Bank itself has to do it, but they have to be the enablers to get this kind of stuff. And it's very simple stuff. It's not rocket science at all, but the impact of that can be enormous. Thank you.
So much. Well, we'd love to have some questions from the audience. We don't have a lot of time, so I think we'll take 3 questions and just take them together. Can anybody who has a question raise their hand? Surely there must be a question, please. Yes, please go ahead. Is there a microphone coming?
Good afternoon. I'm Donna Sims-Wilson, an investor in Africa, and currently I'm an investor in something called the Pan-Africa Exchange, or PANEX for short, which is a brand new commodity futures exchange. It's very interesting to me that commodity futures exchanges exist all over the world. The CME in Chicago, the ICE, the LIFE, all these exchanges around the world, but there is no such thing as a commodity futures exchange in Africa outside of South Africa. And several of you have mentioned pricing for food as a critical issue to development of agricultural markets. And so I'd like to just ask your opinion about commodity futures exchanges on the continent. Thank you.
Actually, there's the ECX, Ethiopia Commodities Exchange, and it's doing very well. And there's a bunch of other initiatives, but I'll let the panel answer that. I just got back from working with Eleni LLC across Ghana, Nigeria, Mozambique. And my question, well, there was a question that was asked here about what's being done institutionally from the regulatory framework to help, and I think it was Mr. Wen who asked it, make Africa more of an attractive destination. And also in terms of what our Honorable Minister Adesina said regarding adding value to the agricultural value chain. One of the things that I didn't hear anyone mention were really what's being done and, as far as these market structures, such as a commodity exchange, or it doesn't have to be necessarily every country's got a commodity exchange, but it could be a regional one and so forth, and how you'd be working together to make these things happen.
Another question, we'll take one more, and then we'll have people start answering. Anyone else have a question? All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry, who was it? Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. The lights are, you're right by the light, so I didn't see you. I'm so sorry.
And my name is Chris Kays. I'm coming from South Africa. I represent the KwaZulu-Natal government, and we're working on an initiative where we want to showcase a number of infrastructural projects in different sectors in infrastructure to try to bring together best practices, bring together the business people from the continent, but have the diplomatic corps represent them when they come down, so you know who are the real project owners, you know who the real guys are that the governments believe can do the business and structure deals between each other, because I think there's a lack of communication across borders, especially on some of the infrastructure projects on interconnectivity between the continent, as far as roads, rails, to get the products to the other markets. So moving forward, but learning on best practices like the Nigerian agriculture. In South Africa, we have, I think right now, nearly 3 million hectares of irrigated land that is unproductive because of our policies, which, I mean, as much as they're good, they're protecting a lot, they're not driving investment into the sector. So learning from your experiences and then moving forward, how would you, I guess, propose to move forward on doing larger collaborations continentally? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we will switch up the directions and have Lutef start with just your thoughts from the three questions.
By the way, I think the question of the commodity exchanges, I think they're taking root in most parts of Africa now. So you may be right that it's very, very pronounced in South Africa.
And it's all done.
But it's there are several initiatives on this that are on. I think a lot of the questions were on the regulatory side, but I agree with the same comment that you made about best practices to see how we can share on that. I must say the minister from Nigeria, he gave us some very large projects, but it was interesting that he even came down to Kenya to see our project, to go and look at the small farmers, and the small farmer was 1/8 of an acre, I remember, but I remember him spending time. So it's that what leads you to sort of understand from each other what's going on. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. Patrick?
Thank you, Carol. I think on the issue of the commodity future exchange on the continent, I think we're still a long way, but what actually might actually give us traction in that direction will be if we can begin to piggyback on the stock exchanges actually that we have on the continent. Because my understanding is that actually there are very similarities in terms of the capabilities and the understanding how actually it could be done. But the future of agriculture on the continent offers a massive potential actually for the Pan-African exchange. So it is something that actually it will take a lot of working on by the various governments on the continent. I think it is something that we might have to work on awareness and educating our political principals so that they can better understand and appreciate the benefits thereof. So it's then that actually we can begin actually to have meaningful traction. But on the issue actually of larger collaborations on the continent, my advice is we might have to look at things like the regional economic communities, the RECs and the AUs and the African Union, because working across governments for projects actually that struggles and covers many countries, it involves a lot of political and sovereign issues. Then working with regional bodies actually gets to help you to navigate those political dynamics. Again, it is something that you might have actually to make sure that you get the agricultural desk within the regional economic communities that actually will give a proper guide on how actually to best target transnational businesses and agricultural businesses in the various regional economic communities of the continent. Thank you, Chair.
All right, well, we are told that we actually have to stop, so we will not be able to, but I would just like to give 1 minute of the last word to the minister to sum things up, if you could, and I'm so sorry to Bruno and Masu. I'm sure you had wonderful things to say. We can get them afterwards, so sorry. But Your Excellency, if you can just sum it up for the last minute and the last word for it.
All right, I'll speak for Bruno and Admas. I think, I think on the market information thing, first is that when people talk about commodity exchanges, a fundamental basis for that is must you have a very well-functioning market information system. So I think that's beginning to develop in many of the countries in Africa, as you have heard. But you have the Malawi Commodity Exchange, you have the Kenya Agricultural Commodity Exchange, you have the East Africa Commodity Exchange, which Hayes Holdings, Olumelu Foundation, and others have done in Rwanda. You also have the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange that's actually done very well. I think attracted almost, I think for sesame and coffee, I think they did about almost $1 billion, sometimes about a year ago. So we know that these commodity exchanges are there, and they need to be deepened significantly. What I just want to say about the issue of learning is that breaking down the barriers between our countries is very, very important. For us in Nigeria, for example, I spent a lot of time in Kenya, a lot of time in Tanzania, in Uganda, in several other countries, learning what they are doing and also sharing with them. And we need to do more of that. And I think the World Bank can help, and also the Africa Development Bank, in documenting best practices and sharing that more broadly among our countries. Also, the Africa Union can play a very important role with regard to that. But the last thing I just want to say is that it's so crucial to also get the ministers of finance and the ministers of agriculture always talking. Because we can be here talking about agriculture all the time, but you do need to have the ministers of finance and agriculture talking. We started that now with a session we had during the UN General Assembly, which we did, and it was fantastic. So I just want to encourage that kind of collaboration, because so many of the things that we have to deal with in agriculture require that the fiscal issues be addressed, and that requires that you have engagement with the ministers of finance, but also central bank governors in most of the countries. I might not have addressed all the things that Marcy and Bruno want, but I think they will agree with me on those ones.
Thank you so much. Well, we've had a wonderful discussion. Thank you to all the panelists for everything they brought. We've heard about all the complexities of agriculture, where the World Bank can be engaging. And I think best of all, the most important takeaway was from the minister, agriculture is cool. So, thank you so much.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.